So it is with great pleasure I get to introduce again Jeff and Carissa, but Jeff is they're tag teaming. Jeff is coming up first. Woo! Can we give her, say hey. Okay.
Okay, everyone, we're going to start with a disclaimer. Your original guest speaker today was supposed to be Pastor Lee, and he took a nasty tumble on Friday, and he had to get some holes sewed up. So Carissa and I came in on, we were notified on Friday afternoon. So this could go any number of ways, but no matter which way it goes, we're going to get at the same place, okay? But there's something important that I want to start off with. It has nothing to do with the rest of the sermon. I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed an absence the last couple of weeks. And the absence is named Bob Linfers. So I'd like us to take a moment and just feel the absence. It's okay. It's normal to miss him. It's healthy to miss him. And while you're doing that, would you please pray for Esther? Just pray for God's closeness for her. And pray for Lee's recovery. Let's just take a moment. God, we thank you for the gift that was your son, Bob. We thank you for the gift that is your daughter, Esther. We thank you for the lives that they touched and the smiles and the laughs that they brought to a lot of people. And we thank you foremost for their service to your kingdom. And we pray also for Pastor Lee's quick recovery. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So our sermon today is going to talk about the stories of two women. One of them in particular, and this is the woman whose story I'm taking up, I think has not really been told very well by the church for about 500 years. It's got a pretty checkered history. I can recall two sermons that I've heard in which her name was mentioned. And both times, instead of her story being told properly, instead of her story revolving around the simple fact that she is a vulnerable, marginalized, and exploited woman, she is made a villain in the story of Abraham and Sarah. So this woman is Hagar. She might not be a household name for you, but I think that responsibility lies on the church for about the last 500 years. And we're going to read her story honestly, and this little mini sermon is just called Hagar's story. And then Carissa is going to talk about Sarah's story and how their stories collide. So for those of you who don't know Carissa and I, this is going to be, in a nutshell, kind of reset-y. I tend to appeal more to the head, and Carissa tends to appeal more to the heart, because you humans have feelings from what I hear. It's the strangest thing. Okay, so Hagar's story begins in Genesis chapter 16. She's there for about half the chapter. And then she kind of falls off the scene, and she returns in chapter 21. Now, both times she's driven off. She's driven off the stage. Both times she's driven off the stage by Sarah. But here's something important that you have to remember. She is a shifcha, and I know what you're thinking. Why didn't anyone tell me she's a shifcha? That makes perfect sense right now. So in biblical Hebrew, there are about 3 words for slave, and they can all also be translated servant. Depends on the translator's decision, because as Americans, we tend to associate certain things with slavery, like chattel slavery. And I think those things can apply to Hagar in this case. But particularly, she's a female servant who serves in a household. Now, before you start thinking, oh, that sounds like light work, contraire, mon ami. She was subject to concubinage, and I'm trying to keep some of the language kid appropriate. She was subject to sex trafficking as a female slave in a household. She was property, and she was at the mercy of her mistress. If any of you are thinking Psalm 123 right now, the psalmist makes this plea to God that says, just like a female slave looks to the hand of her mistress, so we look to you, God, for your mercy and your compassion and your fairness. So this female slave you might think of as someone like Hagar. As a female slave in the household, she was subject to the whims of the male slaves, of the male head of household, and of the female head of household. She was completely powerless. She was voiceless. She was not in control of her own destiny. And this plays out literally in the words on the page. And those of you who know me, you know I'm a grammar geek, and we can talk about that too. Don't worry. So it's possible that Abraham, or Abram, because God hasn't quite renamed Abram, Abraham, and Sarai, Sarah yet, that he picked her up in Egypt when he had gone there several chapters earlier, and he made a deal with his wife Sarai before they go in that they would tell everyone that she's his sister so that they wouldn't kill Abram and then take her into Pharaoh's concubinage. So Pharaoh pays Abram a large sum of stuff: male donkeys, female donkeys, sheep, cattle, oxen, male slaves, female slaves. And we know that Hagar is an Egyptian slave. Then when we meet her in chapter 16, she's not in Egypt anymore. She's not just a slave. She wound up in slavery possibly for a variety of reasons. The Bible doesn't tell us which one, but none of them are pleasant. You're not having a good life if you have to enter slavery. So we meet her in chapter 16 in the land of Canaan. So she's not just a slave, but she is a now displaced person. And as a female, as a slave, as a displaced person, she represents the most vulnerable person in society. So when we read her story honestly, it ought to change our perspective on some things about how God feels toward the most vulnerable people in society. And we're going to tell this woman's story honestly and historically so that it can form something in us pretty deeply that just might help us to treat the most vulnerable in society the way God treats Hagar, with complete and utter seeing. So let's do this. You know what? Before we get into it, because we're already in some sad stuff, Jason, could you go to the happy picture? I haven't told Jason what the happy picture is. Oh, there he is. There he is. That's our dog, Champ. That's right. That's our dog person, Champ. Yeah. Okay, he's the reset pup. If you come to the reset retreat, you'll probably see him. He greets. Okay, the next handful of minutes revolve around two questions about Hagar's story. Two questions. I'm going to ask them. We're going to work through the passage, and we're just going to talk about those questions. The first question is, what do you notice about how Sarai, Abram, and God treat Hagar? What do you notice about how Sarai, a.k.a. Sarah, Abram, a.k.a. Abraham, and God treat Hagar? Because there's a sharp contrast here. And the way Abraham and Sarah treat her is starkly different than the way God treats her. And then, what do you notice about what Hagar wants? About what Hagar needs? About what she fears? About what she resists? What do you notice? So keep heads up on that. What do you notice? Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, Sarah. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Let's note some things. I want to ask you a rhetorical question here. What does Hagar do literally in the passage? What does she do? For you grammar geeks, I'm looking for verbs. What does she do in this passage? It's a rhetorical question because the answer is nothing. She does nothing. Who does things? Abram and Sarah. For example, Sarah owned Hagar. She had an Egyptian slave. Abram slept with her. Sarah gave her to Abram to sleep with her. She says, I put my slave in your arms. Abram says, do with her whatever you want. Sarah mistreats Hagar. And mistreats has this interesting thing in biblical Hebrew verbs that doesn't translate well into English, but this was ongoing. It wasn't just an argument. It wasn't just a blow-up. No, this was ongoing. Hagar is bearing Abraham's son, and Sarah is mistreating her ongoingly to the point where it produces Hagar to run away. So that's what that's what Sarah and Abraham do with Hagar, but what does Hagar experience? She's given as property, first time from Pharaoh to Abram, and then she's given as property from Sarah to Abram, and then she's entered. I'm sorry, but that is the Hebrew. It's not subtle, like some translations call it. No, that's yadai. That's what Adam did with Eve. It's intimacy. This is just all about procreation. It's completely impersonal. It's the same thing that Judah said to his daughter-in-law when he propositioned her for sex because he thought she was a prostitute. He said, let me enter you. That's what happens here. So she's entered by Abraham. Then she's mistreated by Sarah. And she had no choice in any of this because she's a displaced, vulnerable female servant, slave. She's completely an object. She says nothing. She does nothing. She makes no choices. And so what happens? She runs away. But then let's look at how God treats her. Here's the rest of the passage. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that's beside the road to shore. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you'll give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You were the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So that leads us into our second question. The first one was, what differences do you see in how Abraham and Sarai and God treat Hagar? And we're going to follow up with how God treats Hagar right now. But our second question is also, what might it mean that the first person in the Bible to give God a name is a powerless, displaced woman? How you like them apples? She's the first woman God has spoken to since Eve in the garden. How you like them apples? How do you like it that the first person in the Bible to give God a name is a powerless, displaced, vulnerable, voiceless, choiceless slave woman? What does that tell you about God? I see some head nods, especially from the women. It's about time someone preached these kinds of sermons. In 500 years. Okay. So let's talk about, just for a moment, how God is different with Hagar. He invites her into a conversation. For starters, where have you come from and where are you going? It's an open-ended question. He's inviting her to share a story. Because where have you come from is what's made you who you are, what brought you here. Where are you going is where do you plan to go from here. He's asking about her story. It's a powerful story. I keep calling Sarah Hagar. Sarah and Abraham don't. She's a slave, and they treat her as a sex object, as a baby maker. Yet they're still God's covenant partners, by the way. Also remember that she's named God, but there's this crafty Hebrew wordplay going on here. One of those beautiful things about Hebrew Old Testament is the wordplay. And these things don't often translate into English. And it's it's called a perfective verb, and it's a whole completed act. So when she says, God has seen me, and at the risk of oversimplifying, what she's saying is, God has seen all of me. God has seen me wholly, fully, completely. Have I mentioned she's a vulnerable, displaced, oppressed, violated slave woman? And God has found her in the desert, and he has seen every nook and cranny of her soul. Now contrast that with Abram and Sarah, who are still God's chosen covenant people. And on top of that, God blesses her because he's going to bless her son Ishmael and multiply his descendants, which kind of sounds a lot like promises God has made Abraham. And if you're paying really close attention and keeping score at home, it's a birth announcement, and you see that pattern elsewhere, like Gabriel and Mary, for example. Not word for word, but it's a similar pattern. So Hagar has suffered at the hands of God's covenant people. Abraham is a model of faith to this day, but he's not perfect. He's a model of faith because he makes mistakes, and he keeps moving forward. He waits and waits and waits upon God, but all the time he's waiting, he's not waiting still in one place. He's waiting while moving forward with God. He makes mistakes, and he keeps moving forward. So some closing thoughts. God is the God of Abraham and Sarah. He is. And he's also the God of the oppressed, and the poor, and the vulnerable, and the voiceless, and the powerless. He's the God of all of the Hagars of the world, and he's also the God of all the Sarahs of the world. And he'll bless Abram and Sarah because God doesn't pick teams like we do. We might be tempted to say, Abram and Sarah, you treated Hagar that way, we're done. I don't know about you guys, but I'm quite thankful God never says we're done. Good Lord, where would we be? He honors his covenant and his promises that he made to Abram and Sarah, while he respects the dignity with which he made Hagar as a child in his image. So Hagar's not a prop in Abraham's story, and we haven't read her story from the lens of Team Abraham, as the church has done a lot for the last, half a millennia. She has a story, and it's a powerful story. And when we miss the story, we miss something crucial about God, because God wrote the story, and God found Hagar, and God continued to bless her. So he's the God of Hagar, and that's Hagar's story.
All right, well, I would just like to point out that the heady one that likes all the language underneath that blazer, he's wearing a shirt that says Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. Just wanted to point that out because he was very proud of that when he put that on today. All right, so we looked at the story through the lens of Hagar. And now what we want to do is we want to take the spotlight and put it on Sarah. But I don't like saying that, so I'm just going to say Sarah. The next chapter, it'll change to Sarah. But I'm going to call them Sarah and Abraham, even though their names haven't been changed yet. What I want to make sure that we're not doing, and Jeff did such a good job of highlighting this here at the end of his part, is that we don't want to look at this story through the lens of villain and victim. It's really easy to do that, isn't it? Hagar's the victim, Sarah's the villain. But what I want to do is help you to see that Sarah has a story too. And her story is showing up in this, just like Hagar's story is showing up. And when we haven't resolved the pain of our past, what happens is our stories collide. And that's certainly what happens in Genesis chapter 16. So when we reach Sarah in Genesis 16, she's not just a matriarch of a promise, she's also a woman who has lived decades with loss, silence from God, and unanswered hope. Here's what her story includes when we find her in Genesis chapter 16. She's left her home in security in Genesis chapter 12. She was an immigrant. She actually had to immigrate 2 times. She left her homeland, and then she went near the promised land of Canaan. Wasn't the promised land yet. There was a famine, so she endured famine. She went to Egypt, as Jeff mentioned. She was exploited, some would say, given into Pharaoh's household. God rescued her out, but then she migrated back to the land of Canaan. I've never lived in more than one country. Have you? Some of you have, but how about 2 times? How about living through a famine? about leaving your family and everything you know. And then put on top of that, Sarah has decades of barrenness in a culture where identity was tied to motherhood. She's watched a promise being spoken to her husband, not directly to her, but to her husband, Abraham. She's watched it unfold around her. She was 65 years old when God gave the promise that her husband would be the father of many nations. Now, it's implied, of course, because she's his wife, that it involves her, but it was given to him, spoken specifically to him. Then when she was 75, God told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the universe. She's 75 years old. Her friends have had kids. Their kids have had kids, and probably their kids' kids have had kids. She probably has friends that have great grandkids, and she's never seen this promise come true. She's beyond the age of childbearing, and now, in Genesis 16, she's living in a household with a woman who's pregnant with her husband's child. We could sum up her life with one word: disappointment. Disappointment. We break that word apart. The word dis means not or without. Appointment is a designated time. So here's a lady that has a promise from God, but it's without appointment. It hasn't been appointed. It hasn't happened yet. And she's lived in this space for decades. And this isn't just disappointment. This is heart-wrenching, painful disappointment. So as we shift the spotlight to Sarah, I want us to notice the downward progression of how painful disappointment leads to rupture in relationships, because we watch things unravel pretty quickly here in Genesis chapter 16. And I don't want us to just look at their story, but I also want to take what we're reading in the Bible. The Bible's supposed to be a mirror. And I want to take that mirror and I want us to look at us, because this can be us. It's so tempted for this to be us when we have long-standing disappointment. So when Sarah can no longer tolerate the waiting, what she tries to do is manage outcomes. Because I want you to hear this: control can feel safer than trust. We sang all these songs about trust this morning. They were so good. I sought the Lord, and he heard, and he answered. That's why I trust him. And I was thinking when I was listening to that song, if you're Sarah, he hasn't answered, and he hasn't answered, and he hasn't answered. And so her trust gets low, and trust is the foundation of any relationship. And when trust starts to erode, what we turn to is it gives way to control. So when disappointment is unresolved, it gives way to control. Listen to what Sarah says in Genesis 16:2. The Lord has kept me from having children. Do you hear the mistrust? Go sleep with my slave, and perhaps I can build a family through her. Control. She moves from disappointment to control. Here's what control looks like in 2 words: forcing outcomes. Forcing outcomes. And it's so easy to see this in Sarah's story, but here's what it might look like in our own lives: overfunctioning, pushing for decisions because waiting feels uncomfortable, repeating our point until the other person agrees, taking over tasks because it's easier than trusting someone else to do them. Here's another one: subtly pressuring instead of saying what we really feel, sighing, withdrawing, leaving a book on the counter that has a title that's the other person's issue, hoping that they'll read it up. Feeling overly responsible for keeping everything and everyone okay. Not allowing others to fail. Repeatedly bringing something up until the other person gives in. Re-explaining your point until the other person agrees. How about this one? Researching, planning, and presenting the best option so there's nothing else left to discuss. I did about 7 of those things yesterday. Ladies, we're a little more prone to this. You can identify with some of those things. We can look at Sarah's story and go, what in the world? You're telling your husband to sleep with her? What are you thinking? She's taking control. It's a little more socially acceptable in their time, but still, we're like, what are you thinking? But we ask ourselves those questions: do I do some of those things? Why do I do it? Well, when my expectations are unmet, or I'm disappointed, or I start to lose trust in God or people, I want to take control. If I'm starting to step on your toes, let's just look at something a little bit more cheerful. There he is. Lighten the mood up a little bit. All right, here's the next progression downward. So disappointment can lead to control. And then when control takes over, it gives way to relational strife. What's sad about this story is it doesn't seem that Abraham and Sarah stayed inside their grief together. And I just wonder if things could have been different if they would have grieved this together. Because the Bible doesn't say this, but I'm just imagining decades of loss in this area. Decades, before they ever had a promise, decades of being barren. But then after the promise, going years without a son coming, that had to be a huge loss and grief. I would imagine there was some relational strife around what happened in Egypt with Sarah. And what happens when we don't bring our grief into relationships with the people that we love, we can begin to isolate from one another. And it seems to me like Abraham maybe went and grieved alone, and Sarah went and grieved alone, but they didn't come together in their grief. And if they would have come together in their grief and lamented together, been relationally vulnerable, this is how it's bothering me, this is how it's affected us, let's take it to God, let's lament to God together, it would have brought them together in intimacy and united them. But it seems like they separated in their grief. And instead, they pull in a third party, and then Hagar becomes the emotional casualty. Did you notice that the more Sarah tries to control, the worse it gets? And Hagar, who was very powerless, as Jeff described, all of a sudden Hagar has some power, doesn't she? She's got Abraham's child inside of her. She's got a little glow in her eyes. She's been intimate with Abraham. Everything that Sarah has wanted is inside Hagar. And there's so much to relate to here because we see this in our culture as well. When the powerless start to get power and rise up, it threatens the people that are in power. We feel a little bit better when you're down here, but when you're getting a voice, when you're getting momentum, it threatens the people that are in power. And then we also see this relational strain between all three of them because triangulation is happening. The best relationships are a direct line. They're clear, they're kind, they manage conflict well, they communicate directly. But when we start bringing in a third person, can you tell him to tell her? We have to go through another person, things can get complicated. We start laying books on the counter for someone to read. We start withdrawing. We start doing all these other things besides being clear and direct. Things can get super messy, super fast. And so disappointment leads to control. Control leads to relational strain. And when relationships are strained, it gives way to contempt. I want to make sure that we understand that word. Contempt is when we see another person through the lens of scorn, disdain, or superiority, and we start treating them as unworthy of respect and care. And that's exactly what's happening here. Let's reread part of the passage, Genesis 16, 4-6. When she, this is Hagar, knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, contempt. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering," marital contempt. "I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think is best." Contempt to wife. Then Sarah mistreated Hagar. Now we got more contempt. So she fled from her. Please hear what I'm about to say. When personal pain is unresolved, stories don't just coexist. They collide. Abram has his personal pain. Sarah has her personal pain. Hagar has her personal pain. This can't all coexist. If it keeps going unresolved, at some point, they collide. In Genesis 16, we see this intersection of unresolved grief, threatened identity, comparison, disappointment leading to control, relational strain, contempt, and then the last part is it gives way to rupture. Relationships always rupture when contempt is fully bred. And sadly, we see this in marriages all the time. There's a book called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And it's a book by John Gottman. And in his research of marriage, he said the number one predictor for divorce is contempt. It's that feeling of scorn, superiority, where we stop appreciating and respecting the other person. At its core, contempt treats other people as less valuable instead of trying to understand where they're coming from. The opposite is respect and honor, which moves us toward one another, creating space to listen, care, and stay connected. The only person that we see doing that in this story is God. He chases after Hagar. Not Abraham, not Sarah. They can't see her anymore. And Hagar can no longer see them. Here's why. Unresolved pain narrows our empathy. We literally lose the capacity to see people when we haven't dealt with our past. Sarah looked at Hagar and she saw a threat. She saw a replacement. She saw a reminder of her own failure. And then Hagar looks back at Sarah and she sees power. She sees control. She sees invisibility. See their stories colliding? But the God who sees looks at Hagar and sees a person. She sees a future. He sees a future. And he sees a story that's worth naming. He looks at Sarah and he sees the same thing. He sees a person with a story. He sees a future and he sees a story worth naming. God does not see Sarah as a villain. He sees Sarah as a wounded promise bearer. If we read beyond Genesis 16, we see that God really does see Sarah. And the very next chapter is when he renames her and he renames Abraham. And he loops her directly into the promise. And he mentions her by name and says, she will be the mother of the promise. And then in the 2 chapters later, in Genesis 18, is where 3 men appear. Abraham immediately knows that they are not natural men. And this is what they ask. And I love this part. Where is Sarah, your wife? To me, this is God seeing her. Where is Sarah, your wife? And this is that famous part of the story where Sarah laughs. And then she says, no, I didn't laugh. And then I love this line. God says, yes, you did laugh. There's like this weird exchange about laughter, but I think it's the sound of exhausted hope. After all of this complexity, I'm still the heir of a promise. And then God asks this question. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? She's 90 years old at this point. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? He says, I will return to you, listen to the word, at the appointed time. There's always been a designated time for this. She's been without appointment. She's been disappointed. He says, now there is an appointed time next year, and Sarah's going to have a son. Here's what this reveals about the character of God. And Jeff touched on this. But God can see both the wound in Hagar and the promise in Sarah at the same time. We tend to choose sides. God holds them together. He doesn't have to choose between keeping his promise and caring for a wounded person. God's covenant faithfulness is large enough to hold our complicated human lives. So here's the question that heals. It's the question that was asked to Hagar in Genesis 16:8. Where have you come from, and where are you going? It's not just Hagar's question. It's the question that brings all of our stories into God's care. Where have you come from? Each one of you, where have you come from? That question is not just asking for information. I came from Burlington, Iowa. This is the name of my parents. This is the house I grew up in. No. Where did you come from? What have you been through? What's been the mountaintops? What's been the valleys? What are the things that have formed you? What are the things that you've celebrated and the things that God has deposited into? What have you learned from those things? Where have you come from, Hagar? Where have you come from, Sarah? What has God formed in you because of those things? But it's a two-part question. Where have you come from? Where are you going? That's the question of hope. In light of all that you've been through, where are you going? Because God weaves all of that into the equation. When we process the grief, when we forgive, when we heal, when we cooperate with God in the process. He weaves all of that in to where we're going. God is not just about death and burial, about shoving us into the ground, into a dark place. You got to live with this the rest of your life. He's not about just death and burial. He's a God of resurrection. Where have you come from, and where are you going? It's such an important question. When we first started Reset Ministries, we came out of just a colossal pain and wreckage of a ministry that we were a part of. So hurtful, so hurtful. And Jeff and I found ourselves both in so much pain. And what we realized in time was we didn't grieve together. I grieved. It affected me differently than him. He grieved. But we never grieved together. Why do we not want to do that? Why do we not want to come together? So when we first started Reset, everything that we do is about dealing with past hurts, having healthy relationships. Oh my goodness, can I tell you, we first started our first retreat that we did here, it was like 2021. I was hurting so bad because we had been through so much. And then we go into groups, and we're helping people have healthy relationships. And I remember the first round of groups, we had just gone through all this betrayal with people in ministry. And I was hurting so bad. And I'll never forget this. There was a lady that was in one of my groups, and she had been in ministry and had been a missionary. And she stayed after. And in the groups, I'm the facilitator, so I'm letting other people share. I'm not sharing my story. I had to go hire someone to do that, to get the help that I needed. But she didn't know my story, but she knows that where we've been determines where we're going. And she waited after group, and she said, "Hey, Carissa, I just wanted to say thank you for what you've plowed to do what you're doing." Just hearing her say that, I could feel the emotion coming up because she had no idea what I've been through. But unless you plow through the things that you've plowed through, you can't take people through what you've already come through. But she said this. She said, "Thank you for all you've plowed to do this." And she said, "I don't know your story. Listen to this." She said, "But I just want you to know, I see you. I see you." And that hit me right in my spirit. Because when she said it was like God said it, I see you. I know where you've been, and I know where you're going, and I'm working all of the mess, all of the heartache together for good. And I'm telling you today, God sees you. He sees you. He knows the pain. He knows the heartache. He knows what you've been through. He wants to work with you through it because he has somewhere for you to go. You have to cooperate with him in the process. Here's how we're going to end the service today. I'm going to ask you to bow your head and close your eyes. I'm going to ask our prayer team to come forward. In just a moment, they're going to be available for prayer. So woman to woman, man to man, if you want to come forward. But you can go ahead and come forward now. So I want you to bow your head and close your eyes. And I just want you to spend a few moments. They're going to play behind us. And I want you to spend a few moments in God's presence exploring that question. Where have I been? And where am I going? And if any part of where I have been feels unhealed, ask God what he's inviting you into. And if it's not clear where you're going, ask God to begin speaking into that. But I just want you to have a personal conversation with God. And then the worship team's going to finish us out in a worship song. If you want personal prayer, our prayer team is available as well.